A top 10 list, a hardening guide, and a password strength checker walk into a bar. The bartender says, "What is this, a joke?" The top 10 list says, "I'll tell you why it's not." The hardening guide says, "I'll tell you how to make it one." The password strength checker says, "You need a number." So the bartender says, "The three of you need to leave." To which the top 10 list responds, "I'll be back in a few years." The hardening guide shrugs, "I should have done that by default." And then password strength checker adds, "You need a special character." They leave, and the appsec sitting at the bar breathes a sigh of relief. The bartender notices and says, "Yeah, we have standards here." Which means this week we chat with Heather Flanagan about the processes, people, and politics of documenting standards and how RFCs go from comments to completion. In the news segment, benchmarking prompt injection scanners using generative AI to jailbreak generative AI, Meta's benchmark for LLM risks, tapping a protocol to hack Magic the Gathering, and more. Work on your timing and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. AI, accelerated cloud adoption, and hybrid work are fundamentally shifting how business gets done. The old way of securing your people, apps, and data doesn't work and scale anymore. To stay ahead, today's organizations need to reimagine their security and networking infrastructure with a cloud-first, unified SASE architecture. Join Palo Alto Networks and leading technologists from across the globe for SASE Converge 2023, a two-day virtual experience, November 15th through 16th, revealing how SASE, powered by advanced AI, can drive better security and networking outcomes. Register today at securityweekly.com/Palo Alto. This is episode 266, recorded December 11th, 2023. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Wait, is that me? Oh, hey, hi. Good morning.
That's you. John's awake. We can get started. We are also, in addition to looking for John, we're also looking for great guests for all of the Security Weekly shows. Submit your suggestions by completing the form at securityweekly.com/guests. Heather Flanagan comes from a position that the internet is led by people, powered by words, and inspired by technology. She has been involved in leadership roles with some of the most technical, volunteer-driven organizations on the internet, including the OpenID Foundation as lead editor, IETF, the IAB, and the IRTF as RFC series editor, and ICANN as technical writer, just to name a few. If there is work going on to develop new internet standards or discussions around the future of digital identity, she's interested in engaging in that work. Hello, Heather. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Mike. Hello, John.
We're very happy that you were interested in joining us and engaging in a little bit of discovery, revealing, pulling back the curtain, other metaphors on how RFCs in particular maybe, but how documentation of standards comes about, because we have them, we follow them, we implement them, but things don't always go as planned. But maybe before we get into that part as a teaser, tell us a little bit about your background and how do you get into editing and working on RFCs?
Well, as it turns out, one way to do it is to have a undergraduate degree in medieval English history and a master's degree in library
Extremely
science.
relevant.
Absolutely, 100% all the way relevant to where I ended up.
Well, I think, I think it can actually be relevant. We'll nerd out a little bit because there are some aspects of analysis, textual analysis. Does this documentation make sense? But I want to maybe talk a little bit about that process, maybe with RFCs, because I want to say very easy because it's open. There's no dues you need to pay, right, to be part of the IETF. If we wanted to start a standard, what might that process look like?
So it's absolutely easy on paper, but unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case may be, people are involved. So sometimes it's not quite as easy as all of that. But at least when it comes to an RFC, it always starts with an internet draft. You post an idea. The good news is that anybody can post an idea about absolutely anything. And to prove that point, there have been some complete nonsense internet drafts submitted just because. And those usually come about when the conversation comes back up again. Well, why can't I just refer to an internet draft? Because they literally mean, at the moment, they mean nothing. They have no standing. They do have some of them, a fraction of them, do move forward, and they have a couple of different paths depending on what you're trying to do. One of the things to remember about RFCs is not all RFCs are standards. Not at all. Some of them are purely informational documents to sort of give you maybe to capture the use cases of what problems were you trying to solve anyway. So what was in your head when you were actually writing a standard? Sometimes it's experimental, describing literally the experiment that you were running to see how something would work. Sometimes it is on a standards track where it's like, yeah, okay, we do want this thing to become a standard at some point in time. Most of the documents on that path stop at that proposed standard stage. It's proposed standard. It's technically not a full standard yet because that requires a little bit more work. And if you go to the RFC editor website and you look up internet standard, you're going to see less than 2.
So I want to slow down for a second.
Sure.
I don't think we covered it. And I usually don't tune out this early in the podcast. But
I'm so glad I was riveting.
Sorry.
That's how most people do actually handle standards development. Yes,
I know. But so recently, I think it might have been the last episode, Mike, we mentioned RFC, and someone reached out to me and said, what is an RFC? So I'd love us to spend 90 seconds talking about what are these things we're talking about. Because I mean, some of us can unfortunately quote these things, but for either those who haven't had that wonderful experience or just that are new to the space, tell us a bit of a story.
A long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away that looked a lot like UC Berkeley, there were groups of people who were meeting to talk about interesting things they could do with these newfangled computers and networks and make them talk to each other and things like that. And there was actually several groups of people, including one table that included a gentleman named Steve Crocker, another one named Vint Cerf, and a third guy named John Postel. And the way they approached this was to write up some ideas and then send them out requesting comments. They were requests for comments. Steve Crocker wrote the very first request for comment, sent it out saying, well, what do people think? And that was roughly 1970. It's been a while. So RFCs have obviously grown quite a bit since then. There's roughly, I'd have to look up the exact number, but there's now between 9,000 and 10,000 of them. But that's over the course of the last, 35, 40, 50, 60 years, many years. Wait, how old am I? It's not that long. So the RFCs, the Request for Comment series, actually predates the IETF, for example. It certainly predates many of the other standards organizations out there. They kind of grew around this whole concept of having a document series that says, this is how stuff works.
No, that's a great background. And thank you for making sure we're well grounded here, John. Because to be relevant too, HTML has an RFC, HTTP has an RFC, TCP/IP has this. So a lot of things familiar, especially in the web security AppSec world, they do rely on standards. But clearly, HTML has quirks, and you have browsers trying to write to HTML, either write to whatever is the living standard, I think is what they call it now. But we've seen in the past too, just with TCP/IP, we've had ping of death. We've had lots of flaws there that sometimes maybe it points to a standard because it was ambiguous or it didn't have that security consideration section. So before we get into the security parts where things go wrong, tell us a little bit about the participants of this, because you mentioned anybody could write this, but it can also be driven by, well, we're the ones building a browser, for example. Maybe our weight is a little bit bigger than others.
So, yeah, a couple of things can happen. One of the things that the IETF in particular does like to say is that it's all individual. It's all individual participation, right? And there are no membership, there are no dues. It is not pay to play. And on paper, that's 100% true. The reality is a little bit more nuanced than that in terms of, yes, anybody can actually go to, register for a meeting, go participate. It's great. But how many individuals can afford to do that? More often than not, they are, sponsored, paid for, they're coming to do their company's work. And the bigger and more well-funded the company, the more of their people actually show up. So you can have a situation where, and this was probably the most blatant thing I ever saw when I was the RFC series editor, which I did for about 8 years, was for Quick, which is a very interesting protocol of different ways to do things over transport layers. The Google team showed up with T-shirts. Because this was something that Google had brought to the IETF for standardization. They have already incubated it. It's already doing what they needed to do. So they really kind of just wanted it to could you just make this an RFC now? But it kind of hit that interesting wall of reality of, well, now other organizations want to participate. Other organizations need to chime in on it. And yet the room is full of Google people. You can tell because they all had green T-shirts. So if you do a hum, which is one of the interesting, more quirky things that the IETF does to roughly gauge consensus in a room. How does that work when the room is already full of people from a particular organization? That was obvious, and they did work it out, right? Quick did grow and evolve and is now, I think, even better than when Google brought it to us because it had more minds look at it. But you do see that kind of challenge.
Yeah, and one of I like that story because one of the reasons I did want to talk about this was I was curious because I've read some fun RFCs in the past and some of the April Fool's ones. I don't want as a teaser for what's coming, but there's also this aspect of we have to document what we want to accomplish. We have to document a solution. We have to identify a problem and get to that. That's something that a lot of organizations do. Now they may do it to different degrees of detail, not so much always in RFC, but this type of exercise and trying to build a consensus is not unique to RFC. So I'm curious how you've seen this process of building a consensus be successful or lessons learned to perhaps avoid or things to be like, well, we can't always bring T-shirts to the meeting and encourage people that way.
No, but what you can do, of course, is one of the things I think that makes RFCs really useful is you do get so many opinions in a room that you can hash out. You can say, all right, so you're bringing a use case from Corporation A, you're bringing a use case from government B, you're bringing a use case from the privacy sector and some kind of non-government organization, an NGO, right? And all of those perspectives come in the room that lets you look at the idea from perspectives that no one group could possibly have. So ultimately, that does make the standard stronger, right? Because you now are able to see it from directions that you wouldn't be able to see from your one perspective. You also then have an opportunity to see this standard deployed in more places because it now applies to more things. And one of the, how do you, if you write a standard in the forest and no one implements it, did you actually have a standard? When you're writing this and you've got this participation, you're going to see a broader uptake. And the broader uptake will in turn provide more use cases, provide more information, say, hey, you didn't cover this or you didn't cover this adequately, or, ooh, if we just did this one thing, you could do something different. The OAuth working group, I think, is as big as it is for that very reason, right? That it was a relatively, in the scheme of the internet, small group of people that said, we've got this idea, let's come up with, a family of RFCs to talk about it. And now they generally have to have like 3 meetings at every IETF just to get through the list of all the documents and all the ideas that have come in to say, we could just do this one more thing.
Well, I was glad you brought up OAuth because we've actually talked about that over the last year quite a bit. And also, it seems almost the pathological case because there are so many extensions. There's so many RFCs associated with OAuth. Why couldn't they have gotten it just right from the start?
Well, part of it is like, okay, so let's say you build a wheel. Oh, this is really cool. So you had this one idea in your head of, okay, I'm gonna build a wheel and it's gonna do this thing. But it isn't until you use it that someone will say, you know what? If you just like did this thing to it and gave it some texture, it would actually grab the ground better, and that would be really cool. But that wasn't something that was in your head at all when you started. Or, wheels became so successful that people said, you know what, we're going to make roads happen. Roads, there's a great idea, right? We're going to have those, which then inform some changes to the wheel, because now they're going to interact with what they're on differently, right? And the standards are doing the same exact thing. They come up with this really great idea that solves, a relatively constrained set of use cases. And once it's actually out in the wild, you've now got so many more people looking at it and implementing it and saying, hey, but wait, I've got this great idea. What if we did? And it grows.
And that's a great example, especially your emphasis on adoption, people actually using it. This is also where I'm curious that engineers have opinions. Many of them have well-informed opinions. They draw from experience. Many of them maybe just have opinions. And some of these suggestions might be competing. So how then do you start in this process navigate competing use cases or overly narrow use cases?
And that's one of the wonderful things about having a working group, right? Is where you get other people who perhaps aren't so invested in an idea that they can look at it perhaps a little bit more objectively. And then you have the working group chairs who can moderate the discussion because people often very closely identify with their ideas. And then they feel very attacked if you do not, in fact, agree with their idea. And then they can get bitter and let's just say spicy. They can get spicy.
Yeah.
And that's
another thing universal with people. Yes.
Absolutely universal with people. And in the standards development process, right, there is certainly an aspect of that. And one of the hardest things I think people have to learn in engaging with the standards development process is that separation between your idea and you, so that you can have an objective conversation and not feel like they're telling you that your baby's ugly. Because maybe it could be.
It's possible, but in addition, maybe not only is your baby ugly, but it's also insecure. I'm not quite sure how that metaphor works, but roll with me here.
Sure.
But yeah, there is lots of people looking at this. They're adopting it. They have our wheels, but maybe to perhaps better play with that, they want some secure lug nuts, or they want to prevent our wheels from being stolen,
right?
Something like that.
Exactly.
So how do those conversations start to hopefully more than just creep into these conversations? Because I can imagine OAuth, of course, very security minded, very security focused. HTML, HTTP, TCP, IP, they have some security aspects to them, but they're not. Their security isn't in the name.
Right. And several years ago, the IETF in particular started saying, all right, we need to have a security considerations that in every RFC that requires you give this some thought. You have to give this some thought. One would hope that, for everything that's going down the RFC path, that, you'll have your security considerations section, and it's going to be reviewed by even more than just your working group. It's going to go out to the entirety of the IETF, where people will say, please look at this. Tell us where the holes are. Is there consensus that this is something worth publishing and that it isn't going to introduce, some fatal flaw that will break the internet?
Part of that, too, is that there can be insecurity that comes through implementation mismatches. Here is an RFC that recommends a particular design, a particular protocol state machine, but suddenly the implementers go and say, yeah, this is great, we'll adopt it. I'm like, well, are we supposed to go from A to B to C, or can we just skip A to B to D or something like that? How does that ambiguity creep in? How has ambiguity been a risk that you've seen?
It The biggest risk comes with, it's great that you have all the different people in the room, right? And they're all looking at this from different perspectives, bringing different ideas, different visibility into the gaps. But I'm not going to say it never happens, but I have yet to see a circumstance where the people in the room, the ones that are willing to speak up, they are so familiar with this. Right. It becomes they all they can see are trees. They can't see a forest anymore because they've been working on this project, this standard, this protocol, whatever, for so long that they miss some of those things. There's also it's great to have all those perspectives, and as soon as it gets out in the wild, who knows what's going to happen with it, right? And people will use and abuse something in ways that no one expected them to, because it might not be what they consider a sane decision. They're like, wait, you did what? Why did you do that? No one's supposed to do that. Well, you didn't say we couldn't.
Fair point.
Yeah.
So then when you're looking at this, because you've been an editor, as you said, for many years, what does a good document look like to you?
A good document isn't easy, right? A good document is one that actually pays attention to the context in which it was written. It looks at, okay, this isn't it's probably not a shiny brand new topic to the OAuth. We're going to pick on OAuth for a while because we can. It's got how many RFCs right now? Make sure that your language is consistent across all of them. And where it isn't, be crystal clear as to, yes, this term we are modifying this term for this RFC for this reason. Right. That level of awareness of you're not writing in a vacuum. You're probably not coming up with a brand new idea that no one has ever come up with before. And making sure that you set that appropriately, I think, is one of the biggest things that makes a good document. The other thing is having enough eyeballs on it to make sure that it's not got huge gaping holes. You're going to have minor gaping holes, but let's keep them as small as we can possibly keep them.
Always a great thing to reach for. You mentioned, for example, the security considerations. There's an RFC for that, RFC 3552, Guidelines for Writing RFC Text on Security Considerations. So that's something that I want to use as kind of a lead to how can just anyone participate in the process? We did start off and you said you can send out just an email, perhaps. Here's an idea I have. Here's a solution I want to put out there. But do you have to, does participation have to always be showing up at meetings, coming up with that idea, poking holes in that idea, coming with that ambiguity? What are different ways to participate within the whole process?
So one of the folks that I used to work with at Stanford University managed to get some RFCs published about Kerberos without ever actually having been to an IETF meeting. To this day, I don't think he's ever been to an IETF meeting. He participated slowly via the mailing lists. So no, you do not have to go to a meeting. Is it helpful? Yes, because at the end of the day, as much as we all love our Zoom calls and engaging remotely, and why can't we all just do this? Because there's about, a couple million years of wet wiring in your head that change how you interact with people in person. And establishing that relationship makes the whole consensus building process a lot easier. It also makes it a little bit safer for, okay, now you're a shiny brand new person. You've been doing this 2 years and your company said, all right, we want you to go represent us in OAuth. Well, that's scary because you're now going into that room with people who wrote the darn thing for the initial spec. But that's just it. You can then meet them in the hallway and say, hey, look, I'm new and I want to participate. I have an idea. What do you think? That one-on-one sounding board, infinitely safer for most people in how they do that. If they're so introverted that no, sorry, that face-to-face, time out, bad call. The email, join the mailing list, at which point you're going to see who's posting about what. Drop somebody a note saying, okay, hey, just little email. I'm on the mailing list and I'm interested in this topic, but I've got some questions. Could you maybe just help me out? Another great way to do it, write to the chairs and say, I have this idea. Is this something that's actually come up and I just didn't notice because it happened before my time? That, you know what? They love that. Honest to goodness, they do. They want to hear that kind of questions and they do want new people to come in. because every new person that comes in is a new perspective that's going to make those documents better.
Well, I'm curious there to look maybe a little bit to the future, because you mentioned Quick, and I was excited to see HTTP 3 come out, because it's been, 20 years? 30 years since HTTP 2. This is, in the web security world, that's just glacial of having new protocols to read about. HTML, again, pretty glacial. We had HTML5, and then, as I mentioned, the living standard. So are we, and I'm a nerd, I will read some of the RFCs, I admit, but do we have a lot of RFCs growing? Is this a model that is still important and that is growing I'll call it the modern internet age in scare quotes there?
So interesting problem with that in that respect. So I see a couple things happening, given where I sit in the industry at this point. There are more and more what I call de facto standards organizations forming. It's a lot like any other application in the world, actually, if you think about it, where I'm going to date myself a little bit. My first baby was SendMail and writing M4.
Wow.
Yes, that's how old I am. It was SendMail. And I think the SendMail book was about this big for the edition that I first got. And then, it got bigger and bigger because there was so darn much. It was super powerful. It was unbelievably powerful and flexible. And you just had to get a PhD in order to be able to, get through all of the options.
How much of the CF system was your problem?
I had to be writing the rule sets. So,
oh, you poor thing.
Yes, I've never been able to code ever since, but I'll be in therapy for the rest of my life. That's just all there is to it. But the thing is, the point is, SendMail got so big and so complicated because it had it solved for so many things that people said, oh my God, this is insane. Look, I just wanted to deliver email. So let's make Postfix. And then Postfix did this one simple thing. But if you just added this one feature, it would solve my use case too. And then another feature, and then another feature, and then another feature, and then, it may be slightly different shape, but it's just as big and complicated. And we do this over and over and over again, where we create a thing and add to it and add to it and add to it until it's too big to work with. It's just the technical debt that's now living in there is huge. So you reinvent it. You say, I can't do it anymore. Greenfield it. Reinvent something new. Until a couple years pass and it's now grown so big, and then you drop it, greenfield it, do it again, over and over and over again. It's just how we seem to work in IT. So the standards organizations are doing a lot of that same kind of thing. They look at the IETF. This is where the W3C came from, right? Tim Berners-Lee was active in the IETF back in the day, and he said, oh my gosh, this takes so stinking long to get an RFC from my idea to actual publication. You got to go through all these people and all this process, and this is just ridiculous. I'm going to create a new standards organization. And so the W3C formed. And then, it got big enough and had enough process and weight to it, and people having to, go through how many implementations do you have before we're allowing it to be a recommendation, that groups spun off like, what WG? To say, how does HTML supposed to work, and let's make it a living standard and do all the we're reinventing these things over and over again, but not actually solving the underlying challenges that made them as complicated as they are today. So at this point, we're seeing a wealth of de facto standards organizations, one that pick on one idea, saying, look, I just need this one thing to move faster, so I'm going to take it and own it, and it will be a lovely new standard, and it will be great.
Of course it'll be great.
Until people say, oh, but you need to have lawyers because you have to have IPR arrangements, and you do need to actually get buy-in from the people that would be implementing it. And if you want more people to implement it, you need more buy-in, and then they're going to actually want to participate, and it's going to grow and grow and grow. Or it's going to, die and become the mold on the forest floor that then causes other things to grow. Who knows how that's going to work?
Yes, well, no one, I think, is crying over Tim Berners-Lee finally, I think, getting rid of the blink tags. So that is good. But you mentioned, we have been talking about IETF, and you very helpfully added W3C, WG, a lot of other standard organizations. I want to throw ISO in there real quick.
Oh, yeah, ISO.
How does something like that because people say ISO standard. Do you have this for 27001? They rattle off all these 5-digit numbers that sound like CVEs with terrible CVSS scores and high severity. What how does ISO compare to all this?
So ISO is a whole different beast than. So if you're going to classify standards organizations into big, broad categories, you've got your treaty-based ones that are, that come out of the governments, right? That they actually pay for in some way, shape, or form. Very formal, very political. They're their beast, and that's where you get the ITUT, ISO to a certain extent. Some of the national government ones like NIST. Then you have the more industry standards organizations, and that's where you're going to get things like the IETF, the W3C, IEEE. Then you're going to get the de facto ones that are sort of much smaller and more of them, and that's where you're going to get the Kantara initiative. I think the OpenID Foundation is still in that category, though it would love to move up a little bit. Right there is movement between these. OpenID Foundation, a handful of others like that. So they're all working on internet standards. It's how they actually do it and whether that process is open that makes a big difference. When we're talking specifically about ISO is not an open standards organization. For one thing, you usually have to pay to get a copy of those standards, which is, you can have some really interesting political arguments about that because it's also paid for by tax dollars in terms of government membership. So wait, are you like double paying? And anyway, there's drama going on like right now about that. But suffice to say, one of the reasons that that's important is because ISO, countries sign up and say, we support ISO standards because we are members of these things. So by default, what ISO is going to come out with has more weight to a government and what the government will allow, support than say what the IETF comes up with or what the OpenID Foundation comes up with or any of the others, because ISO is treaty-based, right? ISO is big. They're paying for it.
Yeah, I guess if you enjoy trying to deal with ambiguity in documentation, go play with some writing some treaties rather than just some RFCs, right?
Well, I had a really great conversation a couple of weeks ago at a meeting in Paris with someone who was very engaged with the ITU, and the ITU trying to get some of their standards through, IT standards, any other kind of standards, was really hard because the foundational assumption of what is an individual allowed to do versus what is the government allowed to do is so wildly different from the US and Russia, both of whom are voting on the same standard, right? Or throw China in the mix, then throw, EU representatives in the mix. The cultural differences that then align with political differences and, geopolitical warfare, frankly, feed into the standards process. And in order to get anything through requires a level of political savvy that I hope I never have. That just sounds like torture.
I bet what's interesting to think about on that too is how those, I'll say, opinions change over time. So would they vote the same way today that they would have voted for the IP carrier pigeons 20 years ago? I had one more great question. Since I'm speaking, and this comes back to you seem like a normal, well-rounded person. You've been writing these documents for a long time. For those of us who've looked at these, we're familiar with the words must not, required, shall not, should not, recommended, not recommended, may, and optional. And to you, I ask, when you've spent so much of really your life writing these documents, does that, and it is a serious question, do you find how you interact with the rest of the world when you're not working on these? Does that affect what you're doing or how you think about things, or are you able to separate those? Or
sometimes, but not always. Not always. No, I mean, make my living by words
Yeah.
in some way, shape, or form, either from my own blog posts, because I just enjoy writing about some of this stuff in a less formal fashion, or formally in the papers that I put together, or the papers that I'm editing. And I get a little bit pedantic when I see people using words, and I'm like, okay, no, wait, I need you to specify what the heck. When you said must, did you really mean that? I've been working on a document with ICANN for a couple years now, and I'm wrapping up that contract at the end of the year. But one of the things that I've left for them as a homework assignment, and I said, I want you to go through every single should and must in this document needs to be reviewed. Every single one. Is that what you meant? I also get a little bit twitchy when someone starts talking about standards. Are we talking like big S standards that have gone through a process? Or are they talking about like the standard of behavior, a lowercase s standard? Because it matters. When you're actually thinking about what you're going to implement, what you're going to do, those words matter. So yes, I look, there's a soapbox right here. I'm just going to stand on it for a while.
This is why we have you here. This is a great, preach this message. With that, do you have, as we do have to start to wrap up here, John alluded to RFC 1149. Do you, Heather, have your own favorite RFCs that you'd like to share with the audience?
I do. And it does come from the level of, we'll call it passion. We won't say frustration. We'll say passion I have for making sure that words and terms are used accurately. So there is, obviously there's RFC 2119, which is the basic of requirements language. But have you ever seen RFC 6919? That's an April 1st RFC that expands upon the requirements language that we should just go ahead and embrace is what we do on the internet today.
Thank you. So we'll leave more details to our listeners to go do some homework and read that up. And I'll throw in another one, 3514. That's one of my favorite. Also, coincidentally, written on April 1st, like the one you mentioned. Heather, this has been a really fun dive into some history as well of RFCs in the process. Before we let you leave, though, want to ask you, like we ask all of our guests, to describe AppSec in 3 words. And as someone who spends their time with words and language, as you said, I'm very curious what comes to mind for you.
3 words. Just 3.
Just 3.
Just 3.
Must.
Okay. Must. Capitals. Okay. I'm going to say prevention, detection, and exhaustion. So you come from the practical real world experience with application security, I see. Heather, I did also throw in a link to your RFC 6919. That's a fun one, as well as a link to your blog. Is there other things that you'd like to draw our attention for our listeners to, or anything that they can see you perhaps speaking or talking or just writing about more of this process? Well, goodness knows I'm going to be at a number of events in 2024, and I've actually got a list of conferences that might be of interest to anyone, particularly in the identity space, either standards or just informational. And I can provide a link to that. I actually keep it on GitHub in one of the community group repositories for the W3C's Federated Identity Community Group, for which I am chair. But that might be of interest to folks as well, as they want to know, where can I go and have some more conversations about standards, about identity standards in particular. It might be fun.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And Heather, I have to say thank you with a capital T. That's a capital T. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Also want to thank John and thank everybody for listening. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week.